Wow, good morning, ohayo gozaimasu, guten Morgen. Very excited to be here. We live in extremely fascinating times, right? Do you know, when the telephone was invented, from invention to reaching 50 million customers, do you know how long it took? It took 50 years. When television was invented, to reach 50 million customers, it took 20 years. The internet, 7 years. Facebook, 3 years. ChatGPT, 39 days. And the winner is Pokemon Go, 19 days. There's obviously an acceleration of technology. There is an acceleration with which you and I and everybody else digests information. One of the great words of wisdom I received earlier this year was, we are fantastic at communicating from the few to the many, but we are terrible at communicating from the many to the many. Can ChatGPT, can artificial intelligence be an answer to help us navigate the noise, to find the signals that actually matter? Because it is a confusing world. But to make sense of it, I wanted to ask our three navigators, to tell us a little bit about what they are concerned about right now, what they view as the sort of key issues, of concern. And I'm going to be very un-Japanese and put you, Takenaka-san, on the spot here as the first commentator.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity and for nice introduction, Jesper. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, what I have in my mind is, first, we are now in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution, of course, and we are in the midst of the great transition period. Transition. We experienced at the time of the Meiji Restoration. That was a very typical transition. Well, from the feudal society to the modern society, if you agricultural-oriented society to the industrial revolution type of society. So we see so great technological change. Based upon that, world order is also changing. We have been living in the liberal world order, free trade and globalization, the multilateralism, etc., etc. Everything is changing. So under such circumstances, yes, one great factor appears, that is ChatGPT or generative AI. Mr. Kitano, he's the president of Sony AI and the leading spirit in the field of generative AI. He said, now we are in the very beginning stage of Cambrian explosion. Cambrian explosion. From here on, we cannot live. We cannot, this kind of generative AI will change all human activities, human areas. So we should consider from the basement what will happen to the politics, to the economic, and the business, and also our human life, etc. Well, from here on, for example, the productivity will be increased dramatically. Of course, this is a good thing because our wage is very proportional to the productivity. It's a good thing. However, there is a high possibility that the great human, I would say, huge amount of unemployment issue will happen. So we need new system for income redistribution, etc., new work style, reforming, etc., etc. Well, but anyway, many things will change. So we have to discuss very seriously from young. But what got from the transition period like Meiji Restoration is, it will take relatively long time. In the case of Meiji Restoration, well, from the beginning to the, moving to the new stage, it took more than 10 years or so. So this is the reason why Mr. Kitano said we are now in the beginning stage of the Cambrian explosion. So this is now I'm considering that. I really hope you continue this kind of discussion.
Fantastic. So we are in the middle of a great explosion, and it's going to take time. It was interesting, right? The Meiji Restoration, I mean, there kind of was a goal to catch up to the West. I'm not quite sure that we know what the goal is that we're trying to catch up to. But maybe, Jane, for some wisdom from the United States of America. We've been waiting for a long time, but Jane always is a voice of sense and wisdom. Jane, what are you concerned about? What is on your agenda?
Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. I'm sorry to be participating virtually again. I was in person at least 1 or 2 years, but I didn't see my picture in the slideshow, so I can't remember what year. I also did not get a t-shirt, so I want to complain about that. But Yoshi is an amazing entrepreneur, creative and fun person, and this conference is extremely well timed to address this topic. So, and let me say a few things about what's on my mind. Since you asked me, what's on my mind is what just happened in Israel, which was a shock to Israel, a shock to the United States, and I'm sure a shock to everybody else. It is not a shock that tensions were building for years and years and years, and that there is grievance on both sides. Check, we all understand that. What was a shock was that this colossally huge, well-executed attack could swarm the defenses that Israel has. And Israel has a very modern missile defense system called Iron Dome. It also swarmed, or at least evaded, all of the intelligence systems that we have. And that's the point I want to make right now. I can go on a long time about the new war, but that our intelligence systems, both in Israel and the US, and I assume everywhere else, missed this gigantic buildup is amazing. And I have to assume that means were used to evade the systems we have, not just not using cell phones, but other means. And I have to assume, too, that there might have been some mis or disinformation inserted in the system through these modern technologies that made our intelligence analysts, who are very, very sophisticated, think something else was happening, a form of deception, a very dangerous form of deception. So that's one thing that's on my mind. The other thing that's on my mind, how could it not be on my mind, is that our Congress is broken. It literally doesn't have management, and there is no time frame yet, except maybe this week, that a new speaker will be elected. But the signal that sends, not just inside the US government, which is where it sends a bad signal, but around the world, is absolutely huge. At a time when there are so many big problems, our government is not functioning. And we can go into its inability also to understand the most advanced technologies, which is something relevant here. And the final point I would make is that even before Israel, we had Ukraine, which is a huge challenge to freedom in the world. And I just want to commend the last comment, Japan, for stepping up and being a very strong ally of the US, not just in the region as a buffer to some of the actions of a giant neighbor to your west, but also as an ally with the US in the fight for freedom. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. And I mean, this was very sobering, Jane. You've got all this intelligence, and even the best intelligence system in the world got deceived, got faked, right? And then we've got the most powerful country in the world, the United States of America, which, if you're polite, is sort of a kabuki show. And if you're more like Jane, a pragmatist, it is, a little bit out of control here. Now, Bill, from England, from the United Kingdom, a little optimism?
The good news is that I live in Ireland, and we're all in. I'm not Irish, but maybe to be a Brit living in Ireland, you have to be optimistic, right? You have to be positive, and they're going to win the Rugby World Cup quite clearly. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here as well, especially with these excellent fellow panelists and friends. I think that we have to be both sober and optimistic. The sober is the theme that I think Prime Minister Kishida rightly highlighted, that Jane has highlighted, that essentially we know that technology, the new technologies here, are a revolution. They are going to transform the world. But geopolitics, peace and war determines when and how fast it happens. The 1930s was a period of great technological innovation. We didn't benefit from them until after the wars, until the 1950s. So the critical task that we have is maintaining or restoring peace, deterring further conflict, particularly between the US and China. We know that these issues have come back to prominence. Great power competition is back. And some people say, oh, well, that's just the way of the world. Great power competition is the norm, and we had an abnormal time post-Cold War in the 1990s and 2000, and that's fine, that's true, but this is great power competition with nuclear weapons, and as Prime Minister Kishida said. So deterrence, keeping the peace, deterrence and diplomacy, I believe, with fantastic initiative from Japan, is going to be, I think, the great task of our era in making it possible for this technological revolution to realize itself and transform things. Second, more positive, I mean, that is positive, let's make sure we prevent the next conflict and work at that deterrence and diplomacy that makes that conflict not happen. Positive aspect of the turbulence we see in the world, I would say, is that power is actually dispersing. When you look at events, it's tempting to think that basically it's US and China, with Russia playing a troublemaker role, and some of the usual suspects then exploiting things, but basically it's a binary world. I think the great news about what we see is that actually power is dispersing, growth is dispersing, power is spreading. For the first time in memory, Southeast Asia is now growing more rapidly than China. And that's not just because China's entering a lost decade or not, depending on the debate, but it's because actually Indonesia and Vietnam and the other parts of Southeast Asia are growing strongly. If they continue to grow at the current rates, their economies could double in the next 10 to 12 years, just as China's did in the past. That is incredibly positive economically. It's a fantastic opportunity for Japan, because this is a region that you know better than any other country among the Western Alliance. Fantastic opportunity for your businesses. But also, if it spreads power, enables countries to be able to shape their own security environments as they get stronger relative to the bullies, and the bullies, I think, are the US and China, we should be honest about that, then that will be a safer world as well. So I think there are opportunities in the economic shift that's taking place, but also there's some reassurance in it.
Let me elaborate on that and ask Takenaka-san, the choosing between, the two blocks, as it were, the American bloc and the Chinese bloc. No, there is dispersion. Tell us a little bit about your perception how Japan is dealing with it, because Japan is obviously in a superbly interesting place. The largest trade partner on both exports and imports is the People's Republic of China. And then following very quickly, of course, comes the United States, not just in terms of economics interdependence, but also, with a huge, shall I say, somewhat lopsided security dependence. Takenaka-sensei.
Well, of course, the United States is an important ally, and we cannot deny that. Everything, not everything, but most important part is dependent on the United States. At the same time, as you mentioned, as far as the economy and the trade is concerned, China is a very important strategic partner. Well, so as far as our values are concerned, we share democracy, rule of the law, etc., etc. In that sense of the US-Japan ally is very, very strong. However, for each problem, approach is a little bit different. For example, please consider the case of the sanction to China. Well, because approach is sometimes changing. But that is quite usual as the sovereign country. But still, everything, many things are dependent on the US values. Please consider the case of semiconductor issue. Well, semiconductor, this is a very strategic products. Well, in 1980s, Japan's share in this field is over 50% in the world. Now it has been declining lower than 10%. This is because of the US-Japan semiconductor agreement, which was reached in 1986. Now, the United States is implicitly asking Japan to strengthen our capability producing the semiconductor. This is actually happening. So, well, in that sense, we feel some following wind from the United States as far as the economy is concerned. However, of course, it's very difficult as far as security issues concerned, especially Taiwan. Taiwan is very close to Japan, our territory. The distance is only 100 kilometers. 100 kilometers is the distance from Tokyo to Atami. It is very close. So in that sense, we have very careful, depending on the US in security. However, some approaches sometimes are different. This is the big stance of Japan.
Jane, if I can switch to you. America has become, shall we say, a little bit more isolationist. You know, you run a ruthlessly America first focused industrial policy now. You know, yet, you know, there are these two blocks. There is the competition with China, and then there is the global south, which is where all the growth and all the new middle class is going to be created. Tell us a little bit about, you know, how Americans think about this.
In 3 minutes or less. Okay, I'll try.
No chat GPT summary. We want you live with your usual charm.
Well, it's more complicated because the US is a major trading partner with China also. Let's understand that. And US industry wants to continue to trade with China. And China has insisted in some cases, especially our tech industry, has to share its algorithms and other things with China. So in many ways, our business is complicit in China's rise, or at least partnering in China's rise. We have cut off some of the exports of national security sensitive material. And I think that was a good move, but we have not cut off the rest of it. So as we bash China and some of our politicians say horrible things about China, we're also dependent on China. So that's kind of one point I would make. In terms of the global south, they hate that word, by the way, the global south. They think it's disrespectful, but it is a term that many people use, and no offense. I think that the US for too long has been lecturing the lower half of the globe rather than listening. And there, as you said, there are potentially not only a majority of the population, or a huge amount of the population, but the economic growth is going to come from Latin America and Africa. Africa has 54 countries and has the highest birth rate on the planet. So if we don't listen to Africa and engage with Africa, we will lose. China figured this out. We didn't. China has this Belt and Road Initiative, which is in 140 countries in the world and is very popular in a lot of these places. Now, it's true that this Belt and Road Initiative is based on loans, which China will insist on having be repaid. But they're building infrastructure in these countries with Chinese workers. Very smart idea for them. I'm not sure how it will play in the long run, but they have done a better job than we have, we the US, in terms of appealing to whatever you want to call the global south. So that was one of the things you asked me. Just one other comment about a statement made earlier about the power is dispersing. It is dispersing, but it is also true, as that happens, the nation state is declining. A lot of the threats we face, from terrorism, from climate, from cyber, don't respect national boundaries. And so political leaders, you know, whether they are trying to assert power effectively or they're not, have declining power. And that leads to other problems. I mean, some political leaders, I would say Xi Jinping would get the prize for this, are trying to centralize all the power in themselves because they recognize how this trend is perhaps a threat to them. Putin would be another person trying to do this, and it's something we really seriously have to measure.
Jane, can I ask a very quick follow-on question? You said America needs to get better at listening. can Joe Biden or Donald Trump, or I mean, is this really in the American nature to listen?
Well, no, well, not, it's an area for improvement. There are better listeners and worse listeners. I think Joe Biden is getting the message. He's held summits recently with Latin America and South America and with Africa. And he's getting the message because he's watching, this hasn't been brought up yet, the growth of other organizations like the BRICS, full of people, full of countries that we thought were closer to us. And oops, maybe they're not. And so what are some new tools that would be effective? And certainly one of them is listening, which is a form of great respect and which does win friends.
Bill, one thing, if you could talk a little bit about Europe in this context. I mean, I remember growing up as a proud German when the German soccer team did win the World Cup. But we beat the Americans in basketball. Nobody cares. Cheap.
We beat you the first time, by the way.
You always beat us.
No, you always beat us. But
there you go. No. But in all seriousness, I mean, Europe's been under a lot of pressure. There's very high inflation. There's very sticky inflation. There is a wave of immigration that is just relentless. I mean, I just want to point out, if you can trust the statistics, you've got on average now since March. There is twice as many people killed trying to cross the Mediterranean than are being killed in the Ukrainian war. I mean, if you can believe these statistics. I mean, it's the wave of immigration into Europe is tremendous. Energy challenges, you've got the right-wing parties gaining, everywhere. Tell us a little bit about Europe and the role and how Europe, from your point of view, is sort of coping with this radical change that is going on.
Well, I think that you can always identify lots of problems in Europe. And indeed, that is why the European Union exists, because we had problems and this is a solution to it. And then we operationalize those problems through the arguments that take place between our governments of now 27 countries, because one country decided it would take its toys and move elsewhere, called Britain. But there are problems, but I would look at it quite positively in the following two senses. One, when the Ukraine war began in February last year, Europe looked like it was in a deep hole, heavily dependent on Russian gas. Germany especially heavily dependent on Russian gas. We all beat up on Angela Merkel for having let this happen. But 18 months later, we've escaped that dependence, essentially, at a cost, at a considerable cost. But the adaptation of European governments, of European business to the energy crisis has been remarkable. Now, that is thanks to the opportunities given by globalization, i.e., you can find new suppliers because there are new suppliers and it's an open market. But also, I think it's testament to the ability in a crisis to focus effort, and particularly at increasing quite rapidly renewables energy supply. So although we are suffering somewhat economically from the Ukraine war, we've actually adapted remarkably well compared with the way it looked on February the 24th, 2022, I would say. Secondly, again, the politics always produces noise, always produces arguments. Poland has an election in a couple of weeks' time, and one issue that's in that Polish election is aid to Ukraine, just as in the United States, and B, hatred or criticism or whatever of European Union migration policy. But look at the positive. Actually, Europe has been remarkably solid over the Ukraine war. Europe is now, after a slow beginning, a bigger supplier of weapons and financial support to Ukraine than America is. Europe has overtaken the US, thank goodness, as a supplier of support to Ukraine. And actually, although one sees little whispers of criticism and worries about it correctly identified, nevertheless, actually, it looks pretty solid for the foreseeable future. So, yes, I think Europe always has difficulties. It has a similar demographic structural reality to Japan, Italy especially, but also Germany especially. So we have economic burdens that also can make us suffer short-term shocks like inflation a little more severely than the United States. But I think overall Europe has actually recovered quite well from all of this.
Do you think it can be a role model for the global South?
Well, I think that the connections that Europe has with the global South and the balance between lectures and action are better in Europe than they are in the United States. I think that's true. That's true. I don't mean to beat up in the United States on this, but I mean, basically, we do have some better record. Against that, we are basically the ex-colonial oppressors.
Right.
And so therefore, and of course, a Brit living in Ireland has to be quite conscious of that. But actually everywhere in the global South that Europeans go, there's a very high likelihood that we were the former problem to which independence was the solution. So there's a legacy we have to deal with, but actually the engagement of business, of the non-profit sector, and I think of government in a variety of countries in Africa, a variety of countries in Latin America, and perhaps less so in Southeast Asia, is strong. And so, yes, I think Europe can take a lot of initiatives. They won't look like one big, powerful initiative. It'll be a lot of micro initiatives, because we don't do things all that well in a decisive way, as you know.
The reason I bring this up is because of Takenaka-san's early remark that to really unleash the power of this innovation that is going on, that we all sort of sense, but we don't know where it's going, is that we must make sure that there isn't going to be a war in between. Now, I can tell you, as a German, my father, from outside of Düsseldorf, was taught to hate the French. He was born in 1921. I, born 1961, was taught to love the French. And, you know, since, you know, I was 3 years old, I had exchange programs. And my generation of Europeans adores its elite. And the reason is that they actually made true on this promise of building a system that makes war impossible. Remember, that was the premise of the European Union, right, is that we have slaughtered our youth every 20 years over the last 100 years. Let's make this impossible. So the goal was actually a very, very high-minded one. Yeah. Keep this there. As you know, I'm a Japan optimist. I think this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I actually think this is capitalism that works. One of my mentors, 22 years ago, told me, yes, but you're right, be optimistic, but you're gonna have to reconsider if and when Japan starts to increase military spending. So clearly one of the big changes that has happened, not just in Japan, but in Europe, in the United States, in Korea, in everywhere, is that defense spending is growing leaps and bounds. Takenaka-sensei, any insights on, you know, how Japan deals with this increase in defense spending? And, you know, the reason, of course, from an economic perspective, while this is a risk, is if all you do is consume stuff, you know, and improve the air conditioning in the barracks, you don't get any economic multipliers. You don't get any incremental innovation out of the whole thing. So, Takenaka-sensei, the doubling of defense in Japan is real. It's probably the most concrete policy that we've seen in a long time. Your interpretation?
My interpretation, of course, the government or Japanese people do not have any concrete vision on this point at this moment. But anyway, we feel we need to strengthen our power of defense. It is quite true. This has been insisted by ruling party, especially the former Prime Minister Abe. But anyway, considering the current situation, well, many people, Japanese people agree, well, some kind of the increase of defense spending is needed. But we should remember 30 years ago discussion. We used the term peace dividend. Yeah. Peace dividend, what happened? Well, the expenditure on military related issue is, this is military equipment is to destroy something. If this money is invested in, for example, factory, this will produce something. So reducing military expenditure will enhance the growth power Of course, military expenditure have another power. For example, we consider the case of the United States. Military expenditures, created a new kind of technology, including internet, etc., etc. So in that sense, both aspects we should consider. But anyway, we have to increase. Well, only 1% of GDP is now spent for defense equipment. Well, this would be doubled. How to finance that? This is, of course, a very important political issue. Taking this opportunity, I would like to raise one question. This is, next year, 2024 will be the year of politics. Early next year, the election of the Taiwan president will be held. Of course, presidential election in the United States in fall is, of course, very important. And also, the governors of the ruling party of Japan election will also held next year. And also India, the general election will be held, etc., etc. My worry is we now discussing based upon the assumption that we now live in the democratic country, the capitalism, etc., etc. But according to the Swedish Institute with them, they classified the political system into 4 categories. But according to them, only 34 countries are democratic countries in the world. And more than 100 countries are hegemonic state. Well, of course, it depends on the definition. So based upon this kind of election, the nature of the democracy will change. That is the most serious problem for us. That's my worry and my question. I'd like to hear the opinion from European participants and American participants, the election and the democracy.
Jane, your favorite topic. Don't despair.
And we're supposed to be optimistic here. I used to say, if I weren't an optimist, how would I have served in the United States Congress for 9 terms, which I did do. And I didn't lose. I decided to leave to head the Wilson Center, which many people in this audience know, which is how I met Yoshi. So good things do happen. And I spent a decade there. I now chair 2 major projects, though, and one of them is relevant to this conversation. One is called the National Commission on Defense Strategy, which has to do with our budget and our approach to defense in our 2022 National Defense Strategy document. The other one is the board of Freedom House, which is the oldest human rights organization in the US, and which for 50 years has published a report on freedom in the world. Surprise, everybody, freedom's going down, but less fast this year than it has in some other years. But it is very disappointing to see this. I would make this point about our elections and about democracy. First of all, the democracy is a much more complicated structure than just a place that has elections. As we know, Vladimir Putin was elected, and he just held elections in 4 places in the Donbass, of Ukraine, which, surprise, surprise, yielded pro-Russian governments. Shocking. So elections can be rigged, and that is a worry in the United States too. We just had a very public conversation, which is still ongoing in our courts, about who won our 2020 presidential election. The loser thinks he won and took some actions which most of us would think were blatantly illegal, and we'll see what our court system decides about that. But the point is that not only can things be manipulated in elections by the way votes are counted, but there's also a huge chance for mischief using mis and disinformation. And a big worry in the United States is that Russia and maybe others will try to manipulate our 2024 election, and that Russia is very actively right now influencing public opinion on support for Ukraine through the use of mis and disinformation. So 2024 will be a huge challenge for the United States to have fair and free elections, but also I hope to elect people up and down our government, in our Congress, in state legislatures, and so forth, whose first pledge is to our Constitution and to helping the United States, not just protecting their own re-election chances. And we have seen a decline in bipartisanship in the US, which is shocking, certainly to me, because I have always declared myself a member of the bipartisan party. We don't have that, but seriously, as someone who thinks that working with both parties and everyone, it comes up with a better solution. And it's a challenge in the US. I can't comment on the other elections, but a final comment on the US, and it's another worry. Our Supreme Court a few years back decided that the unlimited money could be spent in presidential elections, both by businesses and labor unions and individuals. And we have these super PACs, political action committees, which are not transparent. So we have a huge amount of money that can influence the results of an election. So if we had a better system, maybe like Britain, and I don't exactly know how the Japanese system works, we might also be able to field and elect people who are much more interested in the country than they are in some special interests that fueled their getting there.
It is quite amazing when you just look at the sort of data, and Jane talked about the money. You know, it's quite amazing in the United States. I think the average congressman and senator spends almost 5 times of what the average Japanese politician spends on his or her campaign here in Japan. You know, the other thing, of course, that is a little fun is that the average age of a Japanese person is now 50 years old. The average age of an American is about 38. But the average age of an elected politician in America is 67. And in Japan, the average age of an elected politician, shugin or sangin, is 56. And if you take out Mr. Aso and Nikai, then you end up... Anyway, sorry. The point I'm trying to make is that Japan is actually very good at generational renewal, right? Despite all this talk about the rigidities. Taiwan, Bill, you told us that you're going there tomorrow, and you promised me that you do have a return ticket, which is good. But tell us a little bit about, you know, why you're going to Taiwan and the question that Takanaka-san raised.
Well, I'm going to Taiwan in large part because there is an election there next January, which is going to be of crucial importance. I'm going there because I do think that deterring war, deterring conflict over Taiwan, and therefore also over, if you like, dominance of the East Asian region, is critical to our futures. And I'm going there because very often in the commentary about these issues, we talk a lot about the US, we talk a lot about China, we talk a lot then about other allies, Japan, Europe, but there's very little talk about what the Taiwanese people think and want. And so I think I should go even in a humble way to actually listen to some Taiwanese people. And I think that Taiwan is an extraordinarily interesting country, technologically, now also in the way it's, the major, well, the first and most huge foreign direct investment or renter of a greenfield plant in Japan for how many decades? With the Kumamoto plant really is the biggest and the first. I mean, together with Sony, of course, and now the one in the US. So Taiwan is a forefront country that lives in this anomalous status, and yet actually is a prosperous, innovative, and extremely forward-looking country. So I think it's a model, but also a concern. It goes back to the point about defense spending. It is definitely not productive, but the old saying, if you want to keep peace, prepare for war, you have to basically build up your defense to prevent war, and that is, of course, also what the Taiwanese know extremely well. I think it's absolutely critical for the future development of these technologies that we prevent that war. And the other thing that there is to be learned from Taiwan, I think, and I've got some meetings tomorrow afternoon about this, is the battle against disinformation that Jane rightly raised. Taiwanese, both the government and private sector, have been really at the forefront of seeking to battle disinformation, both within their country, but especially, obviously, Chinese disinformation. And I want to learn from that. And I think that highlighting their lessons probably could be pretty useful for the rest of the world.
Takanaka-san, any quick comments on, Japan-Taiwan relations, aspirations?
Well, I do not have any specific comment on Taiwan issue, but I raised the question of the democracy. The democracy is a very important issue. This is important value to be kept. However, the total title of this conference is Sustainable Innovation. And this kind of innovation, fourth industrial revolution, generative AI issues, sometimes this kind of state capitalism have some advantage. For example, please consider the case of China, sometimes ignoring the data privacy, they can collect big data, and the technological progress in this field that China was successful in that sense. But still, we have to keep democracy. Democracy is sometimes very complicated, as was Jane-san mentioned. But still, so in that sense, Taiwan is a very important partner, as a democratic country. So I really hope you contribute a lot to the discussion in Taiwan. And also, we should, Japanese government also should pay more attention on Taiwan issue. That's my short comment.
Yeah. Please prepare your questions. There is lots of issues here. I want to say something good about the United States of America. Because remember, we started the year and oh my God, Silicon Valley Bank is going to force another global financial crisis, right? Well, it took exactly 72 hours for that thing to be fixed, right? And JP Morgan was very happy, purchasing yet another bank, very cheaply, right? But, the reality is that a couple of weeks later, we did get the ChatGPT announcement. And so the spirit of innovation, the spirit of, actually trying to overcome these challenges through innovative entrepreneurship and giving a platform for entrepreneurs to actually use and explore the technology. If you look at business formation in the United States of America, it's off the charts. And it wasn't just these free riders during the Corona crisis setting up a company to get access to the payroll relief, et cetera, et cetera. It actually has continued to grow. And I dare you, to go anywhere in the United States, whether it's Austin, Texas, whether it's Silicon Valley, whether it's Boston, or whether it's Alabama, right? When you look at the farming technology innovation that's going on there, it still is a very, very powerful place that can actually lead the world, right, in terms of harnessing human aspirations. And that's really the key issue. AI does not create economic growth. It's a tool that can be used. At the end of the day, it's you, and your team that is going to have to generate the growth. And you got to be excited about this. And that's, I think, the sort of democratic freedom, the playground, right, needs to continue to be built there. Sorry, I'm German, I couldn't help it. Any questions from the floor? And Robbie. Now, by the way, German rules do apply. If the question is more than 25 seconds, you have to buy a bottle of champagne for Hori-san. Robbie, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Could I ask the panelists to comment on the impact of income differentials and other differentials on the foreign policy of many countries? US, it's obvious, a lot of trouble in China on this regard, even in Japan, huge differentials hurting children. Could you comment on how these differentials, income differentials, et cetera, and polarization are impacting foreign policy and our ability to realize some of these aspirations?
Who wants to go? Takanaka-san.
Well, thank you for raising very interesting, important questions as well. Fragmentation of the society is actually happening. This will give damage of the democracy. And based upon this damaged democracy, the foreign policy will also change. Many countries will become much more anti-multinationalism. That's my worry. But regarding this differential, the social fragmentation, well, income gap is, of course, a very important factor. Another one is information gap. we live in a very limited information space. Please consider the case you purchase one book through Amazon. The similar books are recommended, and we are connected with similar type of people. So our information space is isolated. This is another important issue to be considered.
Jane.
Yeah. We were talking before this program about whether foreign policy motivates voters. And in the United States, it really doesn't. Ukraine has been a big plus. It's kind of pulled many people into support who normally wouldn't be talking about Ukraine. Flags are flying all over the country, or were flying. And bashing China is our other foreign policy issue, without really full information about how we trade with China and what the point of that is. And if we spend any more time on Taiwan, I would elaborate. But just in terms of being short, I don't think our growing income divide is affecting our foreign policy, but it is affecting our country. And especially when you look at AI and new technology tools, some classrooms are able to use them to train our kids for the future, and others can't afford them and don't use them. And so we're creating an education divide on top of an income divide, which really will impair US innovation, because a lot of the talent pool won't have the opportunity to learn skills.
Bill.
Well, I think this is, of course, a major domestic issue, and if it does, in many countries, and if it does then produce social tensions, there are sometimes foreign policy consequences of those social tensions. But I would agree with Jane that it's primarily a domestic issue. And it leads me to say also that concern about, if you like, the subsidy race, the move to industrial policy based on huge subsidies, the limit to that is public finances, is debt. Economics can be called the dismal science. I'd see it as the optimistic science, because there isn't the money there to do stupid things with it forever. Because also the priority is going to have to be dealing with inequality, because otherwise you won't get re-elected and societies will implode. So the real pressure on public finances will prevent this subsidy war going on for very long. And secondly, the real pull will have to be on these income differentials, in China as well.
Great. Any more questions? And what we're going to do is we're going to take 3 questions, so batch it a little bit. Hori-san.
Okay. Well,
For you too, you buy me a crate of champagne.
I will. So I'm feeling more pessimistic listening to you because of deteriorating freedom and also democracy and regional conflict, war, and the divisions and differential. We didn't talk about climate change. I'd like to become more optimistic. So what would be the one revolutionary way to change the courses of Japan and also politics and business? One proposal.
Okay, dozo. Teraza.
I have a question to Takenaka-sensei and Bill. The internet has brought so many benefits to the world, but at the same time, especially NSS has been criticized for deepening the divide and fragmentation. Today, we're talking about AI, including GPT, ChatGPT. There's so much power and potential, but it could worsen the divide and fragmentation. How can we ensure that AI will lead to growth and not division?
Okay, and one more, please.
I would like to ask what can we do against the disinformation you've just discussed? Well, listening to the trusted people like what's discussed here at G1 Global will be one of the solutions. But what can we do in between, like until the next G1 Global?
Great. Who wants to go and give it a shot? You all have to answer the optimist case.
First of all, I'm not pessimistic, but we need cautious optimism. We should be cautious about that. Well, there could be some solutions. So, the technological progress, it's good, and also this will provide some unemployment problem. So, for example, if we introduce a new system like basic income system or something like that, we can solve the problem. where we should be cautious, but we can solve many, many things. And SNS issues, well, as I mentioned, we live in a very biased information space. But at the same time, SNS, as you mentioned, Teresa-san mentioned, it's providing very good opportunities for us. So, but important point is, for example, please consider Mr. Song of SoftBank. He says he is every day, he's always bouncing his idea off on the ChatGPT. So he's discussing the training, his idea with, using ChatGPT. So this kind of the very smart use of technology, this will help us in many, many ways.
Well, I think in terms of the revolutionary methods, and particularly for Japan, I think we already know the answer. It's basically womenomics. I mean, it is basically female empowerment and removing the barriers, and in particular, allowing proper full creativity and combined with security of employment for the female part of the population and getting them more prominently in politics. So I think that's we know it already, it's just hard to implement. But I mean, basically, I think work harder on that. In terms of internet divides, I'm an optimist about that and about disinformation. I think that the internet has made people generally better informed. I think that people have always been willing to believe conspiracy theories, have always been willing to believe in witches or in something or other, way back to, through history, and I don't think it'll ever change. But clearly the right solution to disinformation and the internet is simply to pay journalists more.
Okay, so I love that last answer about womenomics. Never heard the term. I've just heard Bidenomics. Now I have to talk about womenomics. Really true. We're a majority of the talent pool, for goodness sake. So I love that. My other proposal for change, it was going to be to listen to Gen Z. I was impressed that our vice president has been traveling around to campuses, and she says it's incredible, the enthusiasm and lack of prejudice and information that young people have. So maybe, let's hope, that's one of the secrets. On AI growth, obviously there's a plus side, but there's also a huge minus side. And that relates to my answer to disinformation as well. What will change, or what could change? How could we build consensus around boundaries on AI? I mean, useful boundaries for the world. The only way to do that is to rebuild trust, which is shattered in this world. And I think it's a challenge to leaders, not just political leaders, but business leaders and people who come to this conference, to use every effort they can to create an atmosphere where people want to work together and listen to each other. And when that happens, I think it'll be clearer what material they're reading that is biased and distorted from what material they're reading that is working in a common direction.
Great. One more batch. Okay. And you in the back, and you over here.
Thank you very much. This is Jordan here. So trying to be optimistic, but building on Hori-san's question, and I think technological progress, womenomics, there's a lot to be excited for, but we mentioned in the panel, freedom is decreasing, defense budgets are increasing, Ukraine, Israel, upcoming elections. As the current world order is changing, and you see with G7 and BRICS, et cetera, do panelists expect more armed conflict to break out in the near future? Is that the right way to interpret what we talked about? Thank you.
Nice. To the point. In the front, second, what is it? Third row. And then in the back. Yeah, there was a lady in the back. There you go.
Thank you. So I'd like to hear also more, mainly from Japan, the strategy that Japan has got when it comes to Africa and the global south. And also from the UK as well, I'd like to hear more about your strategies. Thank you.
Okay, and?
I have a question for
Don't be shy, stand up.
Sensei.
It's part of womenomics. Got to stand up.
Yeah. I have a question for Takenaka Sensei. You know, in the context of Japan national debt is at nearly 10 trillion US dollar. What would you see any change in fiscal policy, tax policy to sponsor Japan's need on increasing defense budget? Thank you.
I don't know much about that, but anyway, well, the constitutional law prohibits that in the case of Japan. But anyway, we have to consider the collective defense issue more actively. That's my opinion on that point. And well, Global South, we didn't discuss much about Global South today, but this year's Davos meeting, Guillaume Gelbart, Director General of IMF introduced a very interesting episode. But there are two people walking in the forest. All of a sudden, bear appeared. One person changed his shoes to sneaker. The second person asked him, "Can you run faster than bear?" This person responded, "No, I want to run faster than you." You understand that? So many advanced countries are considering only domestic issues, but we should pay more attention. In the case of Japan, we have TCAT, the considering Tokyo Conference on African issues. So we should strengthen this kind of effort. The third question about debt. Well, this is a very serious problem, I believe. On the other hand, demand for further government expenditures is very strong in the democratic society. However, in the case of Japan, the cabinet office have a very clear plan to balance the basic basic balance of the budget. Well, this is relatively realistic, I think. And so keeping this target, maybe we can control that. And also important point is still, this kind of government debt is financed domestically, financed by the surplus of the surplus saving of the private sector. So this is the current situation. Of course, we should be very careful, but we should not be so pessimistic on that.
Jane, a very, very quick answer, 30 seconds.
Okay, on armed conflict, we have more guns in the United States than people. And we have a huge problem with armed conflict inside our country, let alone in the world. I would argue that cyber and other methods are as lethal as using conventional weapons. But finally, let's not forget that we no longer have a regime to control the growth of nuclear weapons. And on the other issues around Japan, I'll let the experts in Japan answer them. And I'm done, and it's less than 30 seconds.
So quick answer, armed conflict, I don't think that we should worry about more armed conflict. What we should worry about is nuclear returning to be part of armed conflict.
Yeah.
Armed conflicts will always happen. I don't think they're going to increase, but we see an increased danger that they could turn absolutely devastating. That's what we should focus on. Trust, be optimistic about trust. Why don't we trust each other? Because now we know too much about each other. We have the information. We have access to more information than we ever did before. We're better educated than we ever did before. Why would we trust each other when we know so much about each other? That's my basic question. That's why I'm optimistic. I think that this is, we'd like to trust each other more, but actually, I think that that AI and other uses of information are in fact a great opportunity, a great solution. We should not be too hung up about these trust issues, because basically they're the consequence of something extremely good.
Great. I want to leave you with one final thought in answer to Yoshi's question here. Civil society, small communities. Yes, the world's a confusing place. Yes, something happens every split second. Yes, you get angry when you send me an SNS and you don't see the blue light going on, or he hasn't read it yet, right? Focus on your community, whether that is within your company, whether that is within your family, whether that is within your local area. I think that the human-to-human interaction is going to need to be built up, and it's going to take leaders like us Let's not be lazy users of technology. Let's not pretend that technology is going to provide all the answers. They are useful tools, but we are human beings. Focus on your next of kin, your family office. Make stuff happen within the community. And this is where Japan can teach the world a great thing. Kathy and I were in Kyoto yesterday, and it was undokai everywhere, and everybody participates, and if you don't participate, you're going to be murahachibu. Thank you very much to a wonderful panel. Jane from overseas, thank you very much. Bill from Ireland, and of course, Takenaka Heizo, and thank you very much for being a wonderful audience.